Okay, well, I think we've got a reasonable number of people online. We'll probably get more people joining us over the next couple of minutes. Once again, my name is Alex Scott. I'm the branch secretary of Together. Today's briefing is for the broader public service. We will be covering issues that cover a range of collective agreements as well as some specifics in relation to the core, and touching on where we're at with wages. So before I start this morning or this afternoon, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that we're all meeting in across the state and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We will try and get through a bit of material today, but as I said, we are working remotely from the union office given the recent flooding event. So hopefully the technology will be functional for you, but we apologise in advance if there's some failures as we move forward. So in terms of the first item we wanted to cover this morning, people should be aware that the vast majority of public servants will have received a pay increase in their pay packets today for a pay rise that occurred on the 1st of March this year. It's unusual in terms of the public service that we normally have our pay increases in September as part of the collective bargaining processes, but as part of the kind of extended Core EB arbitrations and then negotiations and back into arbitrations, we ended up with a hybrid model in this current arrangement. So in terms of the core and child safety, what we have is we had a series of arbitration negotiations that failed in relation to the award versus the EB 3 years ago. We then went into arbitrations in a variety of agreements with child safety, the core, and with Education Queensland. And then we came out of those processes initially with an arbitration, a negotiated outcome with arbitration on wages, and then after the wages freeze, we then negotiated an outcome in relation to wages that saw those areas which were reliant on the award getting the award increase of 1.75 in 2020, and then getting the 2.5 pay increases in line with the collective bargaining arrangements, which had been subject to the wage freeze process in the public service for a range of other public sector workers, which meant that we got the 2.5% last year and then a 2.5% on 1 March this year. For the core and child safety, we'll get 2.5% again later this year, but for Education Queensland, they've gone for a shorter agreement than the core, and so they'll move into bargaining along with Transport, who's on the 30th of June. The Education Queensland will be later in the year, and we had a briefing this morning. Unfortunately, there was some confusion about this briefing and that briefing. The briefing this morning was just about how wages are occurring in relation to Education Queensland, and looking at whether we need to be looking at a campaign in relation to wages separately from bargaining. But that video this morning will be available for anybody in education who is online this afternoon. But effectively, what that meant was that we were then basically over the agreement's life. We will have got, in terms of education, we had a 3-year agreement. So we got kind of 2.5% plus the 1.75 over 3 years for the core. We went for a slightly longer agreement, as we did with child safety. So they get 2.5% over 4 years plus the 1.75 as well. So that has meant that we are able to get a higher increase than we otherwise would have got, but it is still kind of causing some confusion in relation to why people have got a pay rise at an unusual time of the year. But we're also putting out posters that are available for people to say thank you, union member, for the fact that it was only because of the strong work by members and delegates in the core, child safety and Education Queensland that meant we were able to hold that for significantly higher increases than were offered by the government at the time. And also the fact that we wouldn't have got that 2.5% that came through in people's pay packets today, backdated to the 1st of March without that strong activity from members across the state. The other major issue is clearly in terms of what's happening in terms of vaccinations across the public service. In terms of that process, we have seen a continued rollout of consultation and decision-making in relation to COVID vaccines being applied as mandated by employers across the sector. Last year, we had the CHO mandates in relation to schools, corrections and health, as well as the employer mandate in police. We've now got the majority of government departments have been considering those mandates, and we have been, as part of that process, together members have been considering whether to support the mandates or not. At this stage, the fire service, QFES, has determined not to introduce a mandate. A number of departments have introduced the mandate in terms of transport, DES, DJAG, and natural resources, and DAF and a few others. And we've also got a number of agencies who have finalised their consultation, but all the clear indications, both from staff and from union consultation, has been the overwhelming majority have been supporting those mandates. And we've still got a couple of agencies, such as Cheddar, who haven't finalised their consultation process. And there's a couple of agencies who have yet to consider whether to commence a process, being particularly the Public Trust Office, but also in relation to education non-schools, so Head Office and District Office aren't covered by the CHO mandate. And so there's a question about what that will look like and whether an employer mandate will be introduced into those areas. At this stage, other than QFES, every department has been introducing those mandates. Some of them are employer-wide mandates with the whole agency. A small number are specific to work sites, but the most of those have then ended up in terms of being subject to every work site being defined as a work site. But I think there is still a process to be undertaken in relation to shared buildings outside of 1 William Street, particularly in regional Queensland, about what will happen in terms of exactly if some agencies have got a mandate and some haven't, what that looks like in terms of that process. I think what that will be, that's probably a little way off still, particularly given that Desbert and Cheddar are still in the consultation phase. But also I think the question about particularly what happens in terms of Education Queensland will have some impact about how the decisions are made about particular buildings. And there is a chance that if buildings are determined to be mandated across the building, like they were with 1 William, that even those agencies who haven't got a mandate in place, such as Education Queensland, may get caught up in a building by building process rather than just the employer process. But we would expect over the next week or so to get more clarity on that, particularly I think then the last one that will be, the two last ones which will be unclear about their process will be Education Non-Schools and Public Trust Office, although I think it's likely that the Public Trust Office, if our other agency has adopted a mandate, is likely to do the same. There's also a couple of smaller non-departmental employers who are still working through those processes. So if you're unclear about what's happened within your agency and you're not sure about where they're at, contact the union office and we'll be able to brief you if we've had any engagement at all. But as soon as the employer engages with us, we have started that process of employee balance. In terms of that, I think then that consultation process is close to finalisation. And I think then there'll be the question from there is going to really be around what it looks like in terms of the discipline process that is potentially happening. With that, the union has been working closely with members who have refused to get vaccinated and continue to be employed by public sector agencies. One of the major areas of dispute with ourselves and the government have been in relation to whether or not suspension without pay was an appropriate response. The union continues to think it is not an appropriate response, but unfortunately we lost a key case in the Industrial Relations Commission in relation to that. And so in terms of that, it's likely that agencies will then continue to use suspension without pay, and the union will be seeking through the Public Service Act process, that legislative review later in the year, to seek to have the Public Service Act changed to ensure that there isn't a future abuse of discipline without pay that has been occurring, in our view, in relation to penalising those people who are refusing to accept the employer's mandate in relation to vaccines. And in terms of that, I think the next stage of where to with the conversation in relation to COVID is really going to be thinking about how the world is changing. Certainly, the mandate conversations were dominated initially by the view of the world in relation to the Delta strain. Clearly, we are in a very different set of circumstances in relation to the Omicron strain. But in terms of that, I think we are now going to be thinking, while we are looking at the HR implications and disciplinary processes with the mandate, clearly the mandate isn't the only question that is in relation to that. And certainly from the union perspective, what we're looking at is how do we force evidence-based discussions about the future and what it looks like for our members within the public service. And while the mandates were introduced under a head of power, which the employer has, both in the Public Service Act, but residually as an employer, we're trying to shift the conversation to try and force greater workplace consultation around workplace health and safety, where we have strong rights as workers in relation to that. I know at the last briefing, we talked about the issue of the RAT tests and their, how they would be employed by agencies. And we haven't escalated that campaign at this stage because most departments, other than Education Queensland and schools, have been having a supportive process in relation to the use of the rapid antigen tests in terms of keeping workplaces safe, particularly as we go into winter and the risks around either a new strain coming through or a further spike in either an Omicron or hopefully not Delta, but certainly there is risks around a different strain coming through. And I think looking at what the HR policies are in relation to RAT tests, how we can then use them to keep ourselves safe, but also making sure that those aren't abused by the employers. So I think the RAT test stuff, while we were looking at a campaign, I think outside of schools, we are now comfortable that there will be a reasonable conversation, that they are becoming more available. And now that they're becoming more available, employers are more willing to have rational conversations in relation to what that looks like in terms of implementation, giving staff access to the tests themselves rather than having to pay for their own tests, but also appropriately develop policies. And with that, we're continuing to run the Safer Together campaign, looking at the kind of making sure that you've got accurate information. So if you do go to the Safer Together website, that is, we're able to keep that up to date. There's a couple of blogs posts to go up this afternoon on some of the most recent departmental changes, but generally you should be able to have reasonably accurate information in a timely fashion through that site, so you can see not only what's happening in your own agency through the union emails, but also have an understanding of which other agencies are where in terms of the conversation, not only about the mandate, but also about the workplace health and safety processes. And in terms of that, also thinking through the issues in relation to how we deal with workplace health and safety, particularly in 1 William with its mixed floors and stuff, to try and think through an appropriate workplace health and safety structure to give workers a real say about how we're able to protect ourselves moving forward in terms of an unknown environment, in terms of the winter months potentially being around either a spike or a new variant coming through, and looking at what that looks like in terms of working from home responses, about ventilation, about air conditioning systems, and about general processes, particularly where we're directly engaging with the public. Moving beyond COVID, I think the major issue that we hadn't seen on our industrial horizon this year was the review of culture and accountability that was announced through a press process earlier, a couple of weeks ago now, where Professor Goldrake has now been, who had previously done the review of the staffing cap and some of the Murray data processes, has been brought back to do a review of culture and accountability. Clearly that was driven by the politics in relation to the Korea Mail campaign around some of the accountability issues in terms of government. So the terms of reference are, the process is quite tight. It's a 4-month review, 2 months for the initial project, and then 2 months for the secondary project, with quite limited capacity for submissions. But from Together's view, we think that while it is structurally flawed in terms of some of its processes, we think there is still significant opportunity for us in terms of being able to look at how this review might be able to raise and start to address some long-standing issues that we have, the members have had in their workplaces. So in terms of one of those, we think that there is the question about workplace culture itself. And clearly, we've had significant feedback from members about their concerns about workplace culture. And I think one out of today would be seeking feedback from members as to whether or not, we've got a poll, I think, that we can run in relation to whether or not you think that in terms of our submission, Together submissions for Together submissions in relation to the Goldrake review, whether or not we should be looking at workplace culture, partly in relation to the question of frank and fearless advice, but also I think in terms of workplace culture, there is also the significant issues in some workplaces around workplace bullying. So while I don't think that was something that was on the government agenda when they announced the review, we think that there is certainly it's an opportunity, if we're talking about culture, that is something that we would like to see, whether there is support generally from members in relation to that process. So that's where we're at, and I think looking at those results, I think we can post those results, that there is strong support for that. And I think then the second question is in relation to thinking about the accountability side, and in terms of particularly the issue in relation to recruitment and selection. So this has been an issue that's been subject to the Public Service Act process. Also, the PSC has been doing a review in relation to recruitment and selection, and there's also a CCC investigation review in relation to recruitment and selection within the public sector. And what we'd be seeking today is feedback about whether people online today think there is value in looking at the appropriateness in relation to accountability within recruitment and selection, particularly given the statistical analysis we've undertaken is that the public service appeals in relation to recruitment and selection are next to zero in terms of success rate. There has been some work by the CCC in terms of high profile cases in relation to inappropriate recruitment selection processes. But whether or not members would be interested in, and we'll do a poll on this, whether or not members are interested in having a focus in relation to both our member engagement and our submission process for the Goldrake review about highlighting concerns around recruitment selection and suggesting whether there should be alternative arrangements in relation to recruitment and selection. And in terms of that process, what would be, if there is support for that, and it looks like there is reasonable support online today, what we would be then looking at is kind of two-pronged process for the Goldrake review. Part of it kind of trying to make sure there is a strong voice for public servants in this, and that'll be some sort of poll process to show that is widely and deeply felt by workers around workplace culture, and also widely and deeply felt in relation to recruitment and selection, because we don't want Goldrake just relying on the Working for Queenslanders survey as the only way of testing significant views of the membership, and we think that the union can play a strong role in providing a voice collectively for workers in relation to those reviews, as well as having some ability to submit individual matters. Those are probably going to have to be depersonalised given the challenges around the criteria that has been set by Goldrake in their terms of reference. But I think that would be something processed. So I think we can share those cultural results, but I think certainly they're showing that there is significant processes in relation to support for recruitment selection as being part of the Goldrake process. So in terms of that, I think there is then also a range of other legislative processes that are going on. There is the review of the CCC that has been announced, given the challenges that the CCC has had in terms of their failures around particularly the local government processes. So in terms of that, I think we will be then seeking to have official misconduct and the overlap between official misconduct and some of the other legislative procedures covered, and also particularly thinking about, in terms of legislative reform, there is going to be some changes to the Industrial Relations Act that are likely to occur very quickly. There was a 5-year review undertaken last year, this year, by former Commissioner Thompson and Linda Lavarch, former Attorney General. In that, we think that legislation will probably move quite quickly on that. There may be some challenges around that legislation around what it looks like in terms of particularly the award versus EB issue in terms of wages, but not substantial changes beyond that. I think our concern generally has been that review hasn't really picked up and addressed issues in relation to pay equity and or sexual harassment, which were two key components we thought needed to be reviewed. But also particularly in relation to sexual harassment, we do have some challenges around the fact that the IR Act review has occurred and likely to have quite short turnaround time for legislative reform. We've also got the Anti-Discrimination Commission undertaking a review of its legislation, which is due by the end of June. And then we've got the Public Service Act rewrite with the new Act, which was going to be probably tabled in June. I think that's probably now being pushed to August, September, given the kind of overlap between that and the Goldrake review. We think that that's going to be significant. So I think if we shared those poll results for two, we really want to also talk about thinking about sexual harassment, not just necessarily in relation to the issue around those pieces of legislation, and there's overlapping legislation in relation to both the Industrial Relations Act, the Public Service Act, and also the Anti-Discrimination Act. I think we've also got the question in relation to whether we should be seeing an alternative method of dealing with sexual harassment within workplaces. What we do know is that it is dramatically underreported, not only in the public sector, but also in the private sector, that the current systems are significantly challenging in that regard, and whether we should be seeking to engage with government in relation to an alternative method for trying to provide safe workplaces where people are free from harassment. And in terms of that, we had a meeting of the Central Consultative Forum yesterday on International Women's Day, and we were able to have some significant breakthroughs in relation to how we should be having a conversation with government in relation to that process. And I think if we can run the sexual harassment poll at this stage, what we would be wanting to see is whether there's support from members today in relation to the ability to actually re-engage with government as an employer and seek whether there is support for an alternative method. What is your lived experience in terms of sexual harassment? We certainly know that from the Working from Queenslanders survey that the, if we can get that poll launched. Sorry, we'll just, yeah. So in terms of that process, if we can get feedback from members today about whether there is interest from you and support from you in relation to starting to engage with government in this process. I think that the initial conversations we had at the Central Consultative Committee with kind of at the Director General and Public Service Commission level was, I think that might be an open window for us in terms of conversation. I think the current focus on legislation is potentially tinkering at the edges around what is the way of providing a safe workplace for people. But we would want to, before we engage more with that with government and go further than the breakthroughs that we had yesterday, we would also want to then make sure that there is support from that from the membership. So I think we are getting, I think it is an issue that is significant within a large part of our membership. So based on that feedback we're getting from people today on that poll, I think we would be then looking at being able to prosecute that, but also trying to think outside the square in terms of a significant reform rather than a minor amendments to the current system, and being able to work out what in the current system is meaning that the victims are not reporting. Clearly that is a broken system. So we need to find other alternative ways of ensuring we have safe workplaces for people and that they are able to genuinely raise their concerns in a way that addresses them and has resolution, but also make sure that we can deal with the broader cultural issues to make sure that the behaviour doesn't occur in the first place rather than having a focus just on how to address it. The other issue that came up out of the consultative forum yesterday was the industrial regulation of work from home. Some of this work had started last year in terms of particularly moving away from the individual flexibility arrangements, which are quite time limited in terms of their working from home processes, and moving to something that provides greater certainty for workers, but also provides workers with a collective voice about the kind of mix between office-based work and working from home, which clearly has been a success in terms of a number of our members continue to want to have this access to it. I'd have to say that the kind of one-size-fits-all approach last year hasn't been our experience this year. We have had a number of departments who have been more flexible moving forward, particularly during the COVID spike, and then the challenges around the flooding and the weather events in Southeast Queensland. That while last year there was a kind of keep the coffee shops running approach and not caring about what was happening to public servants. That has been the case in some agencies still, but I think we certainly have seen a greater variation between agencies about their approach to working from home. I think those areas where we're industrially stronger and have had the ability, particularly through the delegates, to engage with employers, we have had some greater success in terms of agencies taking a more sympathetic approach to workers, but also recognising the value of work from home as a disaster process in terms of the floods, particularly in Southeast Queensland, has meant that that level of disruption that we had in 2011 hasn't occurred in 2022 because of the existing working from home arrangement. So from that aspect, I think the regulation process, I think, has been delayed a bit, but given the nature of the Coldrake review and some of the other processes, has slowed down our ability to get outcomes, but we're still hopeful that in the next couple of months that process will be able to move towards finalisation, and particularly then providing workers with greater certainty rather than the current flexible work arrangements, which at one level are okay, but they're too easy for the employer to change their mind and change those situations quite dramatically. We accept that people have to be sent home and working from home in disaster recovery arrangements and COVID response arrangements, but the ability to have people plan their lives around balancing work and family in particular, and kind of school-age kids and those sort of issues, we're looking at something that provides more certainty for workers moving forward. And I think that regulation is close. I think it will probably be, we're trying to work through what it looks like. It'll probably apply through the public service, maybe through policy initially, and then look at what that looks like potentially rolling into the Corey being next year. I'm not sure if it'll get into meaningful discussions in terms of maybe in transport, but probably not in education, Queensland in the bargaining processes, but we'll see how that goes. So I think there is still significant process to move forward with that. And I think then particularly, in terms of that process, that's going to be significant. I think the other key thing with this is there is quite a large reform process that is going on at the moment. We recognise that in terms of those issues, there is going to be significant variation, both at an agency level and in terms of members about what their priorities should be in terms of the Coldrake processes, and particularly making sure we have a strong voice on that and that we're able to get enough members engaged to provide a clear message both to Coldrake and to government and the community about our view of culture and our view in relation to recruitment selection, as well as the challenges around kind of promoting a new alternative situation in relation to sexual harassment, as well as thinking through what it looks like in terms of working from home. So I think what the common thread to all that is that particularly at an agency level, our ability to prosecute this process has been very much based on where we are able to get members engaged, where we're able to get members participating in our surveys, participating in our polls and our petitions. It does make us a much stronger union, and we are able to then get significant capacity in terms of turnaround. And I think what we'd be wanting to see is out of people out of today, whether there is those people who are willing to help promote those campaigns, not necessarily all of them, but the campaigns that are important to you. That will give us an opportunity to continue to build that strength, particularly across the public service. So in terms of those campaigns, we're able to maximise worker involvement. It may only be putting up a poster, it may be just talking to your colleagues. But I think in terms of, particularly around some of those things like Coldrake, the more people who sign up petition, the more people who participate in our surveys will mean that they can't ignore our results. But in terms of that process, that really relies on members being active in the workplace. These Zooms are a good way of being able to provide information, and we'll continue to do those. And we'll try and get them back onto a kind of regular date each month in terms of this process as it moves forward around the kind of challenges around school holidays into April and May. But we're really keen to try and work on making sure that we can reach people who aren't online today and talk to your colleagues about making sure that your voice collectively is heard during that process. So that's pretty much the half-hour mark. I think it's mainly things we wanted to cover today. If you're from education and you missed this morning's briefing specifically about what the wages process looks like for you, that briefing will be online available separately. It is different content than we've just covered because it particularly relates to your bargain and how we deal with wages for education Queensland later in the year. And I'd encourage people to go back and participate in that, but also in transport and in education. We do have the log of claims out for their bargaining processes because their bargains are up this year. We have the core next year, but in terms of being able to make a real difference in relation to workplace health and safety, looking at the issues about culture, recruitment selection, sexual harassment, and also the broader reforms around working from home. If you can get involved, I think it is making a big difference in terms of our ability to win on that. I think we are getting some changes, but the ability to take advantage of the unique opportunity we have over the next couple of months will really rely on your involvement. So thanks everybody for taking your time to participate today. We will be getting through the chat and making sure that we can get on to that. And if we haven't answered the questions that you put to us beforehand, we are putting in, I know we didn't do that very well last year. So this year we are going to make sure that we can get back to everybody who submitted questions beforehand, even if we can't cover them in the actual briefing, that you'll get contacts from the union in the follow-up. But also these sessions are only as good as your feedback. So there'll be an email coming out this afternoon, probably asking you for feedback about how we could do these better. We are trying to develop them. We have had some challenges today, having not being in the union office, but if you could take the time to fill in the feedback survey, that would be really helpful, so we can then work out what works, what doesn't work, and how we can make these half-hour briefings better for you moving forward. So thanks everybody for your time today, and hopefully we'll be able to talk to you individually about making your union stronger in your workplace, so we can make a real difference to your working lives, but also try and make sure that we can log in next time in a month's time and talk through hopefully what progress we've made, particularly around some of those key issues in the next month. So thanks everybody for your time. I'm sorry I haven't been able to get through all of the chat, and we'll get back to you soon.